I was almost 30. My best friend said something unexpected. And I laughed. Not the way I usually did. Not measured, not slightly adjusted. Without thinking about how I came across. Without the quiet awareness of myself. And that was usually always there. It came out before I could shape it. Full, unfiltered. And it surprised me. Because there was no moment in between. No subtle internal check. No quiet question asking, how should I respond? It just happened. And as quickly as it came, it was gone again. But something stayed with me afterward. Not the laughter itself, the absence of control. For one brief moment, something had moved before I organized around it. And that felt unfamiliar, almost emotional. I didn't have language for that yet. I didn't know what it meant that an unguarded love could feel like a revelation. I didn't know that what surprised me wasn't the laughter. It was the evidence that something in me was still capable of opening. That underneath the efficiency, underneath the composure, underneath everything the work had asked of me, something had been set aside. Not lost, set aside. This episode is about what happens when that something starts coming back. Welcome to Psychologist for Escorts. I'm Eva Valora, and if you do this work, or have done it, this is a space built specifically for you, for what you carry, for what you navigate, and for what you deserve to understand about yourself. Across this season, we have been following one process, a quiet process, one that begins with emotional labor and slowly reorganizes the nervous system over time. In episode 1, we explored emotional labor as regulation, not performance, internal regulation in response to another person's emotional state. In episode 2, we looked at what happened when that regulation moves mostly in one direction, when attunement is extended without being returned, and how the nervous system adapts to that condition by becoming more efficient, more controlled, more self-regulating. In episode 3, we explored the cost of that efficiency, how a system that reduces variability also reduces emotional range, how the volume turns down gradually, almost imperceptibly. And in episode 4, we followed that process into identity itself, when composure stops being something you do and starts becoming who you are. This episode is about what happens next, not what was left behind, but how to widen again. The system genuinely became better at regulating, better at tracking, better at staying steady under sustained emotional demand. But efficiency has a cost, and that cost is variability. When the system organizes around one-directional attunement for long enough, it stops expecting co-regulation. The nervous system stops anticipating that the other person will regulate back. It stops making room for the full range of what it once could feel. Not because that range was destroyed, but because it was no longer needed. And what the system no longer needs, it gradually stops making available. Not gone, set aside. So, the question this episode is asking is a simple one. What happens when you want that variability back? When you want to feel more fully again? To be reached more easily? to respond to life without first organizing around the response. What does that process actually require? That process is what we are calling expansion. Not a return to who we were before, not undoing what your system learned, but something more precise than either of those. Widening. The system learned to narrow around efficiency. Expansion is the process of widening beyond it. So, expansion is the system reopening to what it once set aside. And before we look at what expansion actually requires, it's worth understanding one thing clearly, because many women enter this process with an image in the mind of returning to who they were before the work, before the regulation became automatic, before the narrowing. And that longing makes complete sense. Of course it does. When something in your experience changes, the mind naturally surges backwards, looking for the last place things felt easier, more open, more spontaneous. And it begins imagining, maybe I can get back there. Maybe I can become that version of myself again. But expansion doesn't work that way, because the nervous system doesn't reverse itself. It reorganizes itself. The system that existed before the work no longer exists in the same form. Not because it was damaged, because it was shaped by repetition, by experience, by thousands of moments where the nervous system learned something specific about closeness, regulation, safety, and control. And shaped systems don't become unshaped. They expand, they integrate, they develop new patterns alongside old ones. This changes the question completely. Not how do I get back to myself, but what becomes possible when the system no longer needs to remain organized around constant protection. That's a very different direction. The regulation may still exist, the composure may still exist, the ability to track and stabilize may remain highly developed, but the system begins learning that those capacities don't always need to dominate every experience. That regulation can exist without becoming the whole of who you are. That strength can exist without requiring permanent self-containment. So, the goal is not to lose the strength. The goal is to regain flexibility around it. The nervous system doesn't change through insight alone. This is one of the most important things to understand, because many intelligent women quietly assume that understanding something deeply should immediately change it. That if you can name the pattern, trace where it came from, explain exactly how it works, the system should reorganize automatically. But nervous systems don't work that way. They learn through experience, repeated experience. The narrowing we talked about this season didn't happen intellectually. The system didn't decide, I'll become more emotionally contained now. It learned containment through thousands of repeated moments. Moments where regulation was required, where composure was rewarded, where openness cost more than it gave back. And eventually, the nervous system reorganized around those conditions. Not because it wanted to narrow, because narrowing became adaptive. So, restoration cannot happen through force either. You can't simply decide, I'll soften now, I'll receive more now, I'll feel more now, because the system is still organized around protection. And protection relaxes slowly. Not because the mind asked it to, but because the body repeatedly experiences conditions where protection no longer feels necessary. And that kind of safety is physiological, not positive thinking, not telling yourself everything is okay. A bodily experience of nothing bad happens when I soften here. Nothing collapses when I stop managing. That's what begins changing the system. And often those moments are much quieter than people expect. A conversation where you answer honestly and remain safe afterward. A relationship where reciprocity genuinely exists. A moment where you stop regulating slightly and the interaction still holds. Some women try to force this process. They try harder. They expose themselves to emotional situations deliberately. They wait for a breakthrough that doesn't come. But the system doesn't open through effort. It opens through conditions. And early expansion is rarely dramatic. Most people expect healing to feel obvious, transformational, like a breakthrough, a moment where everything opens again at once. But nervous systems usually change much more quietly than that, much more slowly. At first, it often appears as very small moments. A laugh that arrives before management, a conversation that lands more deeply than expected, a moment of closeness where the body softens slightly before the monitoring returns. Small openings, tiny interruptions, is the usual structure of control. And because they are small, many women dismiss them immediately. That meant nothing. I imagined it. That was just a good day. But those moments matter enormously because they show the nervous system is still capable of flexibility, still capable of opening under the right conditions. And what makes these moments confusing is that they are inconsistent. One day something feels emotionally present, the next day everything feels flat again. One moment openness, the next moment regulation returning automatically. And many women interpret this as failure. I went backwards, nothing actually changed. But nervous systems don't reorganize in straight lines, especially systems that spend years organizing around protection. The opening was real. The protection is simply older, more practiced, more familiar. And familiarity feels safer to the nervous system, even when it is exhausting. So, expansion often looks like openings, followed by contraction. Not because nothing is changing, because the system is recalibrating carefully, testing whether openness is survivable, testing whether flexibility creates danger. And that takes time. The system opens slowly because it learns protection slowly too. The first time I cried in years, it happened because of a rabbit. I know how small that sounds, but something changed. I would hold her and feel something soften, not dramatically, just warmer. And one evening, she fell asleep against me. And I started crying. Not because I was sad, because something in me felt reached. It had been years since something reached me, without asking anything from me. No performance, no management, just quiet affection. And I remember realizing I wasn't emotionally empty. My system had just organized itself around control for so long that softness had stopped feeling accessible. And that is what early expansion often looks like. Not a breakthrough, not a decision, not trying harder. A small animal falling asleep against you. A moment where the body softened, before the mind understood why. And it raised the question, if restoration happens through conditions, what are those conditions? The first is reduced demand. Not disappearing from life completely, but less sustained one-directional regulation, less constant emotional management. Think about what your nervous system does in a typical working day. It tracks, it anticipates, it stabilizes, it contains, continuously. And when that demand decreases, something becomes possible again. Availability. Energy that was devoted to containment becomes available for presence, for feeling, for rest. The second condition is reciprocity. Real reciprocity, not attention, not admiration. Reciprocity means the emotional movement goes both ways. Someone notices you too, feels you too, tracks you too, and responds to what they find. After years of one-directional emotional organization, that can feel unfamiliar at first, almost strangely uncomfortable. Your nervous system stopped expecting return entirely. The body unconsciously assumed, I regulate, I stabilize, I carry. But when reciprocity repeats consistently enough, something begins shifting. The system slowly realizes, I don't always have to carry the interaction alone. And that realization is deeply regulating. The third condition is non-performance. Space where nothing is required from you. No role, no management, no stabilizing the atmosphere, just existing. And for highly adapted nervous systems, that can initially feel strangely uncomfortable. Because the body became organized around usefulness, around output. So stillness feels unfamiliar at first. The body keeps searching for the task. Who needs something from me now? What should I be managing? And when the answer is nothing, the nervous system slowly starts encountering something it hasn't experienced in a long time. Rest without vigilance. The thing that changed something in me was a friendship. And every time we saw each other, she hugged me. A real hug, not sexual, not leading anywhere, just warmth. And I remember noticing how uncomfortable my body became. I would stiffen immediately. My body didn't know what to do with touch. That had no expectation attached to it. And suddenly I realized all the touch my nervous system had organized around had been connected to performance, to regulation, to maintaining another person's experience. But this was different. There was nothing to manage. And underneath the discomfort, there was grief. Because I realized how long it had been since touch had simply felt safe. And that grief is part of it too. That moment of realizing how long something has been absent is not a sign that restoration is failing. It's a sign that something is returning, because you can only grieve the distance when you begin to feel the difference. But that return is rarely smooth. And this is important to understand, because most women expect it to move in one direction, forward, steadily, without interruption. But expansion is not linear. This is extremely important to understand, because many women expect healing to move steadily forward. More openness, more softness, more emotional availability, without interruptions. But nervous systems don't move from protection to openness in straight lines. It opens slightly, then returns to what is familiar. Not because the opening was false, because the old structure still feels safer. And when contraction follows openness, many women immediately think, I went backwards. But contraction after opening is often recalibration. The system opened, experienced something unfamiliar, and returned temporarily to the structure it trusts more. Because protection has years of repetition behind it. Openness has very little. And this is why patience matters. Not passive patience, informed patience. The understanding that nervous systems change through repetition, not through willpower. And eventually, with enough safe experiences, the contractions become softer, the openness lasts longer. The system becomes less afraid of flexibility itself, not dramatically, quietly. As the system expands, certain things begin returning, not exactly as they were before, but access returns. Access to feeling something before regulating it. Access to yourself before organizing around control. And often the first thing women notice returning is spontaneity, loving before monitoring, answering honestly before adjusting the response, feeling affection before evaluating whether it's safe. And presence returns too, real emotional presence, the ability to actually arrive inside an experience without standing slightly outside yourself, managing it at the same time. Because long-term regulation creates distance, not necessarily from people first, from experience itself. So when presence returns, the difference feels profound. Music lands differently, touch lands differently, connection reaches deeper. And often, this is where grief appears too. Because many women suddenly realize how long they had been near people without fully arriving emotionally inside closeness itself. And gradually, the body relearns something else too, receiving. Someone offers care, and it actually lands. Someone touches you, and the body softens instead of preparing. These moments sound small, but physiologically, they represent enormous shifts. Many women quietly believe expansion can only begin after the work ends, after they stop, after everything changes completely. And because of that belief, many women stop looking for expansion altogether. Not now, maybe later when things are different. But nervous systems don't work in absolutes. They work in conditions. Expansion doesn't require perfection to begin. It requires enough moments where the nervous system experiences something different. Enough safety, enough reciprocity, enough moments without constant emotional management for the pattern to begin loosening slightly. And that means expansion doesn't belong only to some imagined future life. It can begin now, quietly, in small moments. A friendship that feels different, a relationship with reciprocity, a moment where you soften unexpectedly. These moments matter because nervous systems learn incrementally, not all at once. So if you recognize yourself in what we explored this season, the automatic regulation, the constant tracking, the efficiency that slowly narrowed emotional range, the identity that formed around composure, around control, around strength, and finally the quiet moments where something began opening again, a love that arrived before management, a moment of touch that softened something unexpectedly, a feeling that reached you before you organized around it. Let all of that mean something very specific. Not that you are broken, not that you lost yourself, not that your system failed, because everything we described this season was adaptation. The nervous system reorganizing around what it believed was necessary, quietly, efficiently, automatically. But this season was never only about narrowing, it was also about possibility. The possibility that the same nervous system that learned protection can also learn flexibility. That what became less accessible is not necessarily gone. And availability can change, not through force, but through new conditions. Through moments where the body no longer needs to remain fully organized around protection and management. And maybe those moments begin very quietly, so quietly you almost miss them. A moment of presence, a moment of softness, a moment where your body responds before control arrives. Those moments matter because nervous systems change through repetition, and every moment of safe openness becomes new information for the body. Information that says, I don't always have to stay protected here. And over time, that information accumulates, quietly, the same way you once learned to protect yourself. I'm Eva Valora. This was episode 5 of the first season of the Psychologist for Escort podcast. This season, we followed one process, from the first moment emotional labor asks something of your nervous system, to the moment the system reorganized around it so completely that the reorganization started feeling like you. We looked at what that costs, what it narrows, what is set aside. And we ended here with the quiet possibility that what was set aside can slowly become available again. If any part of this season landed for you, I want you to know something. That recognition is not small. For many women in this work, naming what is happening internally is something that has never been available before. No framework built for this profession. No language precise enough. No space that was both clinically grounded and built from the inside out. This is that space. In season 2, we go deeper into one of the most misunderstood mechanisms in this work. Something many women experience every day without having a name for it. Something that gets called presence or professionalism or simply being good at this, but underneath those names is something more precise. A process the nervous system learned of being there without being fully there. Of staying present on the surface while something deeper remains protected. Dissociation. Not pathology, not damage, a learned capacity. One that made the work possible, and one that, like everything we explored this season, has a cost that deserved to be understood. Season 2 begins soon.